Thank you again for being here today and for your interest in the Growing Up in Ireland study. So I'm basically catching up now with these same children that Liz has just talked about, 3 years, and looking at their lives at 5-year-olds. But I'm looking at a broader picture, like a kind of snapshot of how life is in different areas for these 5-year-olds. Okay, so what's special about being 5? So at 5 years old, for most children in Ireland, the big thing is starting school, and most children around 5 will have started school in this country, and that brings it with a whole new set of experiences, contact with new places, new people, and learning new skills. And at the same time, development is continuing rapidly. So, for example, their cognitive and language skills are expanding, and that facilitates learning the new material in school, but also communicating better with the new people that they're meeting around them. Their motor skills are also developing, so more complex play, say for example on bicycles or playing football, becomes more possible, and they're usually better able at things like going to the loo and getting themselves dressed and things like that. And all that also facilitates that kind of transition to the school environment. Social skills are also improving, so for example with the new language skills, children are better able to label their emotions, they're better able to communicate their needs and wants to the people around them, and again that's especially important when you're talking about going to a new school, new people, new adults that they don't know. They also should be showing signs of being better able to regulate their behaviour, so that again that facilitates being able to kind of sit still in the classroom and also to get on with their new classmates. But development, even it's progressing rapidly, and you do get a lot of variation on an individual child basis, but it's really important for us in Growing Up in Ireland to consider that development takes place in context. So the most immediate context for 5-year-olds are going to be their family, their parents, their siblings, their grandparents perhaps, and also now the school context, so teachers, their classmates, and things like the facilities and supports that the school can provide. But even within that sort of microsystem, if you like, all that is set in an even bigger context. So things like the economic context, Liz has just spoken about the importance of that, because say, for example, in times of recession, that affects money that's available for public services. It affects employment opportunities for parents and perhaps, as we've seen, stress within the household. There's also the cultural context, so in terms of general beliefs among the community and the parents about, like, say, what should parents do, what's a child and adult roles, and that changes over time as well, as we've seen. And of course community, so the things are, communities, the physical environment, things like play spaces, the air quality, things like that, but also the community support, and resources that are available from the people in the community. So development isn't just the child making his or her own way through the years, it's also being affected by their family, their school, and the wider context. And that's important to consider for a study like Growing Up in Ireland. So as I said, we had interviewed these children previously at 9 months and 3 years, and we went back to them at 5, and we managed to re-interview over 9,000 families of 5-year-olds at age 5. So an interviewer went out to the house and interviewed the primary and secondary caregiver of the 5-year-olds in around spring, summer of 2013. The primary caregivers were mostly the child's mother, and the secondary caregivers were mostly the child's father, although not exclusively. While the interviewer was in the home, they did some direct assessments. So, for example, they measured the height and weight of the 5-year-olds and the weight of the parents, and they also did some cognitive tests with the 5-year-old. We followed up that home survey then with a survey to the child's school. So that took place in the autumn, winter of, say, 2013 into early 2014. And we sent questionnaires out to schools, and the teachers and principals told us about the school characteristics, about how things were in the classroom, and also some details about the individual children as well. So I'm now going to give you kind of a whistle-stop tour of some highlights from the report. Obviously, you've seen from that there, the report is very big and quite extensive, so I'm just picking out a few things in the different areas that we've covered. So as I said, school is probably kind of the big thing at 5 years old, so I'll start with that. So when we were interviewing the parents in spring, summer 2013, about almost 3/4 of the 5-year-olds had already started school the previous September, so that was September 2012. And because we have kind of a mix of children, so our children were born between December 2007 and June 2008, it was interesting to see that nearly all of the oldest children, so those who would have been about 4 years, 9 months in that September 2012, most of them had already started school. But then when we get to the youngest children, those who've been born in June 2008 and were only 4 years and a few months in that September 2012, only about a third of them had already started school. For children who hadn't already started school, when we asked the parents about why they hadn't yet started, the most common reasons, as you might expect, were that they thought the child was too young or they didn't think the child was ready for school yet. What's another interesting fact about this cohort is that they were among the first children to avail of the free preschool year scheme, and what we see that nearly all the children before they started school had completed this free preschool scheme. Now, as I mentioned, we had a follow-up survey where we went to the schools and we asked the teachers and principals about how school and the individual children were doing. So by so autumn winter 2013, pretty much all the children had now started school. So we asked the teachers quite a few things, but one of the things we asked her about the basic things that children need to be able to do when they're starting school. So we asked, for example, about their dispositions and attitudes. And say for the three more basic items, such as with some adult support, being able to dress and take care of their own hygiene. Their teachers were saying that about 3/4 of 5-year-olds met about 3 of those basic characteristics in terms of dispositions and attitudes towards school. And a similar proportion were met all 3 basic indicators for language, for communication and thinking. So that's things like being able to listen and respond, sort of fairly basic things that you need to be able to interact with the school environment. We also asked the teachers about how the children were doing on specific school subjects, so not just their general kind of readiness for school, but how they did on things like English, Irish and maths. So the teachers tended to be quite positive about how children were doing on speaking and listening in English. In fact, they rated over 40% of children were said to be above average compared to what the teacher would expect for an average child. But for Irish then only about 23% were above average, and the big chunk were about 56% were rated as average for Irish, 19% below average on Irish. And for maths and numeracy, about a third of children were described as being above average, about half then in the average category, and 10% below average on maths. But we do see some early social gradients starting to emerge in relation to school-related outcomes. So as I said earlier, nearly all the children did take part in the free preschool year, but we see gradients in other areas. So, for example, when we asked parents if they hadn't been for the free preschool year, would you have sent the child to preschool anyway? And what we see is that if we look at that and compare it to family income, for example, so here on the left-hand side of the graph, in the red column, you have the highest income families. In the dark blue on the left, you have the lowest income families. And what we can see is that pretty much almost all the high-income families said they would have sent the child to preschool anyway, but only 60% of the lowest-income families would have sent the child to preschool anyway. So you can see free preschool year making a big impact for those low-income families in their decision of whether or not to send the child to preschool. However, parents did have an option to pay for additional top-up hours as part of the free preschool year, and again we see some gradients where among the highest-income families here in the red, nearly half of them paid for top-up hours, but only just over 10% of the lowest income families were paying for those additional top-up hours in the free preschool year. We also see some gradients in terms of those teacher ratings of the child's ability in subjects that I was just telling you about, English, Irish, and maths, and so forth. So here again, the lowest income families are in the dark blue and the highest income are in the red. And these are children who were rated by the teacher as being below average in the various subjects. So English here is the first pair of bars, and we can see that 22% of children in the lowest income families were described as being below average in English by the teacher, compared to just 7% of the children in highest income families. Similarly for Irish, 30% in the lowest income were described as being below average, and 10% the highest income. Slightly less of a gap for maths, although still favouring the highest children in the highest income groups. But interesting, when the teachers were asked to describe how the children were doing in arts, for example, the social gradient is much narrower there, just 9% compared to 5%. So it wasn't just the children globally got kind of lower ratings from teachers if they were in lower income groups. It does seem specific to some of those language and maths subjects. So, of course, the flip side of this is that actually most children, even in the lowest income groups, were still rated as average or above average. So, it's not a blanket scenario, but still the trend is there for those children to be at least described as being below average if they're in the lowest income groups. We also see some gender differences emerging in relation to school. So here the boys are in purple and the girls are in yellow, and this is looking at how many of them had started by their month of birth. So here I'm going from the children who were born in December 07 to those who were born in June 08. And so, for example, as I said, the children born in June 08, they would have been only about 4 years and 3 months in September 2012. And we see that for the oldest children, there's no difference between boys and girls and whether or not they'd started school. Pretty much all of them had already started school. But when we get to the younger children, we see that the younger girls are more likely to have already started school than the younger boys. And in those subject ratings, those English, Irish, Maths, those teacher ratings of whether or not the child was below average. So we see certainly for the two languages, English and Irish, the boys were more likely here in purple to be in the below average rating from a teacher on English, and again in Irish. However, it evens out for Maths. A bit of a gender gap though still here for arts, which we didn't see, do you remember, for arts in relation to the social gradients. So I'll move on to health. So obviously health is another key indicator for the child's well-being. The overall picture was positive. Over three quarters was described as being very healthy, and most of the remainder were healthy but with a few minor problems, and that's based on the parents' description. 18% were reported to have a long-standing illness, condition or disability, and that was quite a wide definition, so something that was affecting not just their physical health, but perhaps their emotional health. The most common conditions were asthma. 8% of the sample overall were said to have asthma as a long-standing condition, and eczema and skin conditions were also quite prevalent at 4%. However, I suppose the headline, is the number of children who were overweight or obese at age 5. 20% in total were overweight, and that was made up of 5% obese and the 15% in the other overweight category. Children who had been already overweight at 3, girls and where parents were overweight were more at risk of this having an overweight or obese status at age 5, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So we see that there's inequalities in health indicators as well. So here, if we're looking at this is the number of children who were described as being very healthy by their parents, again by income, lowest income in the dark blue and highest in the red. So even though in one sense you could say there's only a small gap, but it's still at this age we're still seeing a gap appearing where the highest income children are the most likely to be described as very healthy. But more starkly, I suppose, when we look at the overweight and the obese, so when we're looking at here, here the darker shade of turquoise is overweight, the lighter shade of turquoise is the obese. So when we add them together, we can see here on the left, in the lowest income category, 23% of children of 5-year-olds in total are overweight or obese, and this contrasts to just 16% when we can compare it with the highest income families. So that is of concern as well. But remember we said that context was also important. So what's interesting is that when we look at the parents' own weight status, so this graph is just for children in 2-parent households, and we're comparing whether there's no parent overweight, one parent is overweight, or both parents are overweight, and how that relates to the child's own weight status. So here we can see on the left here, this is where for children where neither parent was overweight in a 2-parent household. And we can see in the green here, over 9 in 10 children were not overweight if neither of their parents were overweight. 7% were overweight, 1% obese. But if we jump here to this column here, where both parents in a 2-parent household are overweight, we see a much bigger group here. Over 28% of children are overweight or obese in households where both the parents are also overweight. So that suggests the importance of context, and whether that's shared environment or maybe not recognising the child's true weight status. But it is very interesting in terms of looking at the importance of context for child health and development. The last thing I'll talk about in health is childhood injuries. So at 5 years, we collected more detailed information than previous waves on injuries and type of injuries. So up to the age of 5 years, about just over a quarter of children had sustained an injury that required medical attention from a doctor or a hospital or an out-of-hours clinic or something like that. Most of those children had just had the one incident requiring medical attention, but 5% of the sample had had more than one such injury. We asked then primary caregivers about the details of the most recent injury, and the most common type of injury was a head injury that didn't result in a loss of consciousness. So about 30% of those children with an injury, or about 8% of the total sample, had had a head injury that needed medical attention. And the next most common were cuts that needed stitches or glue, and a broken bone or fracture. So they were the most common injuries. As you might expect, I suppose, the child's own home was the most common location for that injury to have occurred. So I know Liz has already talked in detail about socio-emotional development and parenting, so I'll just say a little bit about those at 5 years. So one of the questions that we asked at 5 years was, did the parents think that the child had any difficulties in emotions, concentration, behaviour, being able to get on with other people? And nearly 1 in 5 parents reckoned that the child did have some difficulties, but the vast majority of those said that those difficulties were minor. Just about 4% said that they were sort of definite or severe. We also asked about in terms of whether those difficulties seem to be more prevalent in different groups. And what we see is that, for example, that in one-parent families, the parents were more likely to say the child had some difficulties. Parents of boys now saying that more likely to say the child had some difficulties. Also low birth weight. A modest difference here on the urban-rural, and that's our overall, so 19% said the child had some difficulties. However, bearing in mind that most parents had said those difficulties were minor, when we asked them then about if those difficulties were disrupting the child in terms of their home life or friendship or learning, in the blue here we can see that actually most parents reckon that those difficulties didn't disrupt those areas. So about half of parents were saying that there was no impact on these various home life, friendship, leisure activities, etc. And about a third to a quarter were saying there was just a little difficulty brought about by their concerns. However, that does leave a small group of children for whom that do have more definite difficulties and who are experiencing disruption to these areas of life as a result. We also asked about play. So I hope you like my little infographic. Okay, so we asked the parents about what kind of activities the child did every day. So in this graph, the bigger the bubble, the more popular the activity was. So we think about 2/3 of children were said to kind of do some sort of chasing or running type games pretty much every day. Make-believe play here you can see also very popular. Things like climbing, somewhat less popular. As you imagine, it's a bit more difficult and possibly parents are not so encouraging of that particular activity. But also things like crafts, art, dance, music, also quite popular among 5-year-olds, and ball games and bike. But what's interesting is that we also saw, if we look back at children, when they were 3, we asked the parents whether the child tended to prefer physically active games or inactive games, or maybe had no preference. And what we see is that the children who at 3 were described as preferring physically active games, they tended to do these things like playing ball and riding a bike more often than at 5. So it seems like the preferences are kind of emerging quite early. And then a little bit about family life to conclude. So in terms of the types of families, using a fairly basic description based on the number of parents and number of children in the household, we can see that here at 78%, being in a 2-parent family with at least one other child is the most common scenario for 5-year-olds. And we see that over time you get more, the number of children in the families is increasing. So in terms of how many children are 2 parents and just the study child, now just 8% of the 5-year-olds were 2 parents and an only child, like me. 9% were 1 parent and 2 or more children, and the remaining 5% were 1 parent and just the study child. So what's interesting though is that when you just look at the basic breakdown of family type in terms of 1 parent to 2 parent, it's relatively consistent over time. But if you look now longitudinally at individual change, we can see that things do change for the household. So, for example, this is now just comparing their family type at 9 months and at 5 years. And we see that most of the children were in two-parent families at both the earliest and latest time points. 82% were in a two-parent family across time. But 4% moved from a two-parent to a one-parent. 10% were consistently in a one-parent family. And another 4% had started in a one-parent family at 9 months, but by the time there were 5, they were in a two-parent family. So significant changes there if you think about the level in terms of parents moving in and out of the household. So even though, as I said, even though the overall proportions look consistent over time, when you can look at individual change, you do see that there is change occurring. We also asked the parents about their work-life balance. So in terms of the primary economic status of the parents, so remember I said primary caregivers tended to be the mothers and the secondary caregivers tended to be the fathers. We can see that working outside the home, 84% of the secondary caregivers said this was their main economic status, and 55% of primary caregivers or mothers worked outside the home as their main status. For the remainder then, so most of the primary caregivers, if they weren't working outside the home, they describe themselves as being on home duties. About a third of primary caregivers, an additional 5% were unemployed. On the other hand, for secondary caregivers, for those who weren't working outside the home, the majority of the remainder describe themselves as unemployed, 11%, 1% as on home duties. But so for those parents who were working outside the home, we asked them about work-life balance and how their family and work life was affected. So what we see is that when parents were asked about their work responsibilities, meaning that they had to miss out on family activities, we see about half of primary and secondary caregivers who work outside the home reckoned they had missed out on family activities because of work, slightly more for the secondary caregivers. And also in the reverse, if you say because of your family responsibilities, you've had to turn down work opportunities, activities, and we see around about a quarter, but somewhat more of mothers here who said that they had missed out on work opportunities because of their family responsibilities. Parenting context then. So as Liz said, between 9 months and 3 years, there was a big increase in the number of households who were experiencing economic strain, as indicated by them saying that they had difficulty making ends meet. So about 25%, a quarter of the families at age 5 said they were having great difficulty or difficulty making ends meet. An additional 42% said they had some difficulty making ends meet. So you're talking about just over only a third of families were said that they were making ends meet with relative ease. So most families were experiencing at least some economic strain at age 5. Remember, that was in 2013. What we also see is that about 1/3 were experiencing great difficulty or difficulty making ends meet at all 3 time points. So that's consistently starting at 9 months, 3 years, and 5 years. When we visited them again, at each time they were having difficulty making ends meet. And what we also see is that percentage of consistent difficulty making ends meet was much higher among larger one-parent families than over half of those were saying that they had consistently difficulty making ends meet. But despite the overall sort of negative economic context at that time, most parents had positive relationships with their children. They reckoned that in terms of the child's interactions with them, it was high in positive aspects, was low in conflict, and they were generally warm and consistent in their parenting. And that they also regularly used positive discipline strategies with their 5-year-olds, such as explaining why a behaviour is wrong, and fewer negative strategies, so kind of punishment type strategies. So now, my final slide, you'll be glad to hear, is on non-resident parents. So as one of our audience members asked earlier, so not all children live in two-parent families. They have a parent who lives outside the household. And so we asked the resident parent about what kind of arrangements they had for that non-resident parent and how often the child saw the other parent. So about 14% of 5-year-olds had a parent outside their household. The majority of those couples that had a non-resident parent had never lived together. About half had no particular parenting arrangements in place, and the remainder were going to split between having a formal parenting arrangement or an informal arrangement. What's interesting, though, is the diverse set of experiences that seems to emerge in terms of those non-resident parent families and the contact with the other parent. Because about a third of children seem to have very regular contact with their non-resident parents, so they saw them face-to-face several times a week. But we then see a substantial minority, about a quarter, who never had face-to-face contact with their parents. Now, for some children, they would have had sort of maybe contact by phone instead of face-to-face, but you still see quite a kind of a mix of experiences here. We also saw that about a third of resident parents said they received regular maintenance payment from the other parent, and about another 14% got some payments on a sort of an as-required basis. But again, that leaves with a remainder, nearly half, who received no payment. And we also asked about sort of additional supports that the non-resident parent might provide. So we asked about a couple of different things, such as kind of looking after the child or paying for things. And the most popular additional support was that the non-resident parent bought gifts, clothing, etc. for the child. About 19% of non-resident parents were described as doing that often, and another 25% did it sometimes. The remainder were rarely or never. Okay, so quite a mix there of experiences for that type of family. So I'm going to wrap up there.